Chapter 4. The Price of Energy. The mismatch between the tertiary economy of money and the primary and secondary economies of goods and services impacts every dimension of our economic life at the end of the age of cheap, abundant energy. Still, the dimension that will have the most direct impact on us is that of a collapsing money economy on energy itself. The potential for trouble here can be gauged from a glance back over the way that the peak of global oil production has already affected the price of energy. The mismatch between the tertiary economy of money and the primary and secondary economies of goods and services impacts every dimension of our economic life at the end of the age of cheap, abundant energy. Still, the dimension that will have the most direct impact on most of us is that of a collapsing money economy on energy itself. The dimension that will have the most direct impact on most of us is that of a collapsing money economy on energy itself. The potential for trouble here can be gauged from a glance back over the way the peak of global oil production has already affected the price of energy. In the run-up to the 2005 peak of world conventional petroleum production, nearly everyone who was concerned about the world's energy future agreed that the law of supply and demand would define the world's response to the end of cheap oil. As existing reserves depleted, the idea went, the collision between rising demand and shrinking supply would drive prices up. Some people insisted that this would lead to more drilling, more secondary extraction, and other measures that would produce more oil and bring the price back down. Others insisted that this would lead to the discovery of new energy resources of one kind or another, which would produce more energy and bring the price back down. Still others insisted that this would finally make renewable energy cost-effective, and at least keep the price from rising further. A minority of pessimists argued that none of these things would happen, and the price of oil would rise steadily on up into the stratosphere. None of them were right. Instead, starting a few years before the peak, oil prices began to move up and down in jolts of increasing violence, culminating in 2008 with a drastic price spike driven by speculative greed, followed by an equally drastic crash driven by speculative panic. The 2008 spike did drive some additional production of oil, mostly from old wells that were uneconomical when oil was $30 a barrel, but made plenty of economic sense when it topped $130 a barrel. But most of that additional production was shut back down during the crash that followed. Meanwhile, the economic shockwaves from petroleum's boom and bust played an important role in kicking the props out from under an already shaky global economy, making capital for new energy ventures hard to raise and forcing governments to cut back on the subsidies that have made alternative energy technology economically viable. The results of that impact are still spreading through the world's economies as I write this. One thing that already became clear amid the bouncing rubble, though, is that models of the future that assumed a steady upward rise in prices have failed to predict the much more complex reality of spike and crash that is shaping our energy future. And as a note, in the last year or two, he's written quite a bit about the fracking bubble as well, which he didn't write about much in this book. Somewhere in the American Midwest, perhaps where a half-completed ethanol plant whose parent company has gone bankrupt is being sold for scrap, and oil leases bought for sky-high prices in 2008 sit unused because the current price of oil won't pay for their development. The dream of a smooth market-driven transition to a different energy stream is rolling across a field with the tumbleweeds. Meanwhile, the price of oil is continuing its stubborn refusal to obey the law of supply and demand. Demand has dropped as consumers and businesses caught in the economic downdraft cut consumption, and stockpiles are ample. But the price of oil has more than doubled since its 2009 low, following a slow, ragged, but unmistakable upward trend. Oil has shown the same habit of standing economic rules on their heads before. Back in the 1970s, one of the great challenges facing the economics profession was the riddle of stagflation. According to one of the most widely accepted rules of macroeconomics, inflation and deflation, which can be defined as the expansion and contraction, respectively, of the money supply relative to the supply of goods and services, form two ends of a continuum of economic behavior. Rising prices, rising wages, and increased economic activity leading to overproduction are all signs of inflation, while flat or declining prices and wages and diminished economic activity leading to recession are all signs of deflation. In the wake of the 70s oil shocks, though, the industrial world found itself in the theoretically impossible situation of an inflationary recession. Prices were rising, but wages struggled to keep pace, and economic activity declined sharply. That was stagflation. For more than a decade, economists tried to make sense of the riddle it posed, before finally giving up, with a certain amount of relief once the Reagan-Thatcher years arrived, deciding that it was an anomaly that had gone away and didn't matter anymore. To many economists who tried to make sense of stagflation, it was clear that the oil crises had something to do with it, but this in itself posed its own awkward questions. The economics of commodity prices have been studied exhaustively since the time of Adam Smith. The behavior of the world economy in the face of rising oil prices violated everything economists thought they knew. Only a few economists at the time, and even fewer since, realized that these perplexities pointed to weaknesses in the most basic assumptions of economics itself. E.F. Schumacher was one of these. He pointed out that for a modern industrial society, energy resources are not simply one set of commodities among many others. They are commodities, the core resources that make economic activity possible at all, and the rules that govern the behavior of other commodities cannot be applied to energy resources in a simplistic fashion. Commented Schumacher, quote, "I have already alluded to the energy problem in some of the other chapters. It is impossible to get away from it. It is impossible to overemphasize its centrality. As long as there is enough primary energy at tolerable prices, there is no reason to believe that bottlenecks in any other primary materials cannot be either broken or circumvented. On the other hand, a shortage of primary energy would mean that the demand for most other primary products would be so curtailed that a question of shortage with regard to them would be unlikely to arise." Unquote. Schumacher is right, and events certainly seem to be pointing that way. Another of the basic flaws of contemporary economic thought comes into sight. Attempt to treat energy resources as ordinary commodities misses the crucial point that energy follows laws of its own that are distinct from the rules governing economic activities and trump these latter rules. Trying to predict the economics of energy without paying attention to the laws that govern energy itself, the laws of thermodynamics, thus consistently yields high grades. One implication that has to be grasped is that the rules that apply to other natural resources, such as minerals, do not work when applied to energy. As North America's deposits of high-grade iron ore become exhausted, the iron industry simply switched over, as already mentioned, to lower grades of ore, contain less iron per ton than high-grade ores, but are much more abundant. And improved technology for extracting the iron makes up the difference. In theory, at least, the supply of iron ore can never run out, since industry can simply keep on retooling to use ever more abundant supplies of ever lower grade ores, right down to the modest traces of iron salts dissolved in the sea. Try doing the same thing with energy, by contrast, and you will not get very far. The only way the iron industry can use lower grades of ore is by using larger amounts of energy per ton of iron produced. And the same rule applies across the board. The lower the concentration of the resource in its natural form, the more energy has to be used to extract it and turn it into useful forms. If you try to do this with energy, you very quickly reach the point at which the energy needed to extract and process the resource is greater than the energy you get from it. Once this point arrives, the resource stops being a source of energy. You might as well try to support yourself by buying $1 bills for $2 each. Where energy is concerned, concentration counts for much more than quantity. Difference is a consequence of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that the energy in a whole system always moves from more concentrated forms to more dispersed forms, doing work on the way, and the higher the difference in concentration, the more work can be done. In subsets of the system, energy can move against the flow of entropy, from low concentrations to higher ones, but the process always involves more energy moving from higher to lower concentrations somewhere else in the system. Let me say that all again. This is really important. Where energy is concerned, concentration counts for much more than quantity. That difference is a consequence of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that the energy in a whole system always moves from more concentrated forms to more dispersed forms, doing work on the way. And the higher the difference in concentration, the more work can be done. In subsets of the system, energy can move against the flow of entropy from low concentrations to higher ones, but the process always involves more energy moving from higher to lower concentration somewhere else in the same system. The energy concentrated in fossil fuels got there by precisely this process. Hundreds of millions of years of sunlight falling on prehistoric plants flowed through the biosphere and was dispersed as waste heat, so that a small fraction of that energy could be concentrated in a few locations in the biosphere and buried underground in the form of fossil carbon. This is why those who expect the universe to hand us some new and improved energy source to replace our dwindling reserves of fossil fuels are fooling themselves. It took an extraordinarily complex series of processes, more time than the human mind has evolved the ability to grasp, and an equally unimaginable amount of energy input from sunlight and the Earth's gravity and internal heat to produce the highly concentrated fossil fuels we've wasted so casually over the last 300 years. At the beginning of the industrial age, those fuels were the most highly concentrated, naturally occurring energy sources that existed on any scale anywhere in this end of the known universe. Even in their current state of depletion, they still are. Now, it's true that there are plenty of other energy sources left as fossil fuels deplete. All of them are either much scarcer or much more diffuse than the fossil fuels. This is as true of fissionable uranium, which occurs in little more than trace amounts in raw uranium ore, as it is of renewable sources such as the sun and wind. Any of these can be concentrated until they will power modern technology, which is designed to use highly concentrated energy sources. Still, there's a catch. If you need to use up a great deal of concentrated energy to concentrate the diffuse sources into a form that can be used in our technologies, and once you subtract the cost of concentration from the energy supplies available to a post-fossil fuel world, there generally isn't much left. Energy follows its bliss. At this point, it's necessary to take a closer look at the least popular of all the laws of physics, the second law of thermodynamics, more popularly known as the law of entropy. To call this law unpopular is not to say that it suffers from any lack of recognition from the scientists. A comment by Sir Arthur Eddington, one of the 20th century's greatest physicists, is typical. Quote, "If your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, there is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation." Unquote. A summing up so useful that it probably deserves to be called Eddington's law. Entropy is the gold standard of physics, the one thing you can count on, even when the rest of the cosmos seems to be going haywire. What makes it unpopular is simply that it stands in stark conflict with some of the most deeply and passionately held convictions of modern industrial humanity. For all that, it's a simple concept to grasp. Every time you pour yourself a cup of hot coffee on a cold morning, you experience entropy in action. Over the following 30 minutes or so, the coffee will get colder and the air around it will get very slightly warmer until both are the same temperature. Left to itself, energy always moves from higher to lower concentrations. That's the second law of thermodynamics. As it makes its way from higher to lower, the energy can be made to do useful work. And if you're clever enough, you can even force some energy up to higher concentration by allowing a larger amount of energy to go to a lower one. But entropy's price must always be paid. Human beings don't like to think in these terms, and for the last 300 years, most people in the industrial world haven't had to. Beginning with the 18th century breakthroughs that allowed coal to be turned into steam power, fossil fuels and the technologies built to use them have given human beings command over amounts and concentrations of energy never before wielded by our species, and convinced most people in the industrial world that energy was basically free for the taking. In the halcyon days of industrialism, it was all too easy to forget that what looked like a vast abundance of energy was a cosmic rarity, a minor and finite backwash in one corner of a solar system where energies flowed on a scale too great for human beings to comprehend. Most people in the industrial world thus find it next to impossible to think of energy as a limited commodity. The resulting assumptions run deep in our culture. Bright American 10-year-olds, for example, as soon as they learn about electric motors and generators, come up with the scheme of hooking up a motor and generator to the same axle, running the electricity from the generator back to the motor, and using the result to power a vehicle. It seems logical. The motor drives the generator powers the motor, perpetual motion results, you hook it up to wheels, and away you drive on free energy. I was one of those 10-year-olds, and one of the boxes in my basement may still contain the drawings I made of the car I planned to build when I turned 16, using that technology for an engine. Of course, it didn't work. Not only couldn't I get the device to power my bicycle, that was the test bed I planned to use for my invention, I couldn't even make the thing run with no load connected to it at all. No matter how carefully I hooked up a toy motor to a generator salvaged from an old bicycle light and gave it a spin, the thing turned over a few times and then slowed to a halt. What annoyed me at the time and fascinates me now is that the adults I told about my project understood that it wouldn't work even without a load and told me so, but had the dickens of a time explaining why it couldn't work in terms that a bright 10-year-old could grasp. This isn't because the subject is overly complicated. Why perpetual motion won't work is breathtakingly simple. The problem is that the way most people nowadays think about energy makes it almost impossible to grasp the logic involved. We all learn in school that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, and we also learn that energy can be defined as the capacity to do work. Most people, even when they don't think their way through the logic involved, combine these two statements and end up thinking that the capacity to do work can neither be created nor destroyed. And so there's always enough energy on hand to do whatever work you happen to want done. The only problem with this sanguine view is that the real world doesn't work this way. The reason why the real world doesn't work this way is the second law of thermodynamics. Because of that law, how much energy you happen to have on hand doesn't tell you how much work you can get out of it. The amount of work you get out of an energy source depends not on the amount of energy contained by the source, but on the difference in energy concentration between the energy source and the environment. Let me say that again. The amount of work you get out of an energy source depends not on the amount of energy contained by the source, but on the difference in energy concentration between the energy source and the environment. And then he says, please read that again. The amount of work you get out of an energy source depends not on the amount of energy contained by the source, but on the difference in energy concentration between the energy source and the environment. Got it? Now let's take a closer look at it. Left to itself, energy always moves from more concentrated states to less concentrated states. This is why the coffee you poured a few pages back gets cold if you leave it on the table too long. The heat that was in the coffee still exists because energy is neither created nor destroyed. On the one hand, it's become useless to you because most of it's dispersed into the environment, raising the air temperature in your dining room by a fraction of a degree. There's still plenty of heat in the coffee since it stops losing heat when it reaches room temperature and doesn't continue down to absolute zero. But room temperature coffee is not going to do the work of warming your insides on a cold winter morning. In a very small way, as you sit there considering your cold coffee, you're facing an energy crisis. The energy resources you have on hand, the remaining heat in the coffee, will not do the work you want them to, warming your insides. Notice, though, that you're not suffering from an energy shortage. There's exactly the same amount of energy in the dining room as was there when the coffee was fresh from the coffee pot. No, what you have is a shortage of the difference between energy concentrations that will allow the energy to do useful work. How do you solve your energy crisis? One way or another, you have to increase the energy concentration in your energy source relative to the room temperature environment. You might do that by dumping your cold coffee down the drain and pouring yourself a fresh cup, say, or by putting your existing cup on a cup warmer. Either way, though, you have to bring a further supply of concentrated energy to bear on the task. Anytime you make energy do anything, some of it will follow its bliss and pass from a higher concentration to a lower one. You can use this effect by allowing a smaller amount of highly concentrated energy to disperse, or by allowing a much larger amount of modestly concentrated energy to do so, or anything in between. Continue the coffee example. You can warm your insides with a small amount of piping hot coffee or a larger amount that has cooled down somewhat. One way or another, though, the total difference in energy concentration between source and environment decreases when work is done. Mind you, you can make energy do plenty of tricks if you're willing to pay its price. No matter what you do, though, you end up with less concentrated energy than you had when you started. This is why my great discovery at age 10 didn't revolutionize the world and make me rich and famous, as I briefly thought it would. Electric motors and generators are ways of turning energy from one form into another, from electricity into rotary motion on the one hand, and from rotary motion into electricity on the other. Each of them necessarily disperses some energy into waste heat in the process. Thus, the amount of electricity that you get out of the generator when the shaft is turning at any given speed will always be less than the amount of electricity the motor needs to get the shaft up to that speed. This is what gets missed when people assume that the amount of energy rather than its concentration is what matters. Heat in the waters of the world's oceans, for example, could theoretically provide enough power for the world's economy to keep it running for some preposterously long period of time if it were possible to extract and use it. And every so often, somebody tries to build a machine to run on that energy. All these machines fail because it takes energy to concentrate energy, and the energy you need to concentrate diffuse heat into a form where it can do something useful is more than the energy you get out of the process. One common way to avoid thinking about our energy predicament, that follows along very similar lines, is to cite the quantity of energy that arrives on Earth by way of sunlight every day, and note that it's vastly greater than the quantity of energy our civilization uses in a year. That's true enough, but it misses an essential point. By the time sunlight crosses 93 million miles of space to get to us, it has become dispersed enough that it can do only modest amounts of work in its current form, and concentrating it is very costly in terms of energy. That is why it takes millions of dollars in complex motorized mirror systems to focus sunlight onto a boiler and produce steam, when this could be produced with much simpler technology and a much lower cost by burning fossil fuels. The energy in the fossil fuels is more concentrated, and thus much less energy is needed to put it to work. More generally, any time you suggest in public that energy forms a crucial limiting factor for civilization, you can safely assume that somebody will respond by insisting that the amount of energy in the universe is infinite. Now, of course, Garrett Hardin was quite right to point out in Filters Against Folly that when somebody says X is infinite, what's actually being said is, I refuse to think about X. The word infinite functions as a thought stopper, a way to avoid paying attention to something that's too uncomfortable to consider closely. Still, claiming that there's infinite energy in the universe misses the point in another way as well. Whether or not there is an infinite amount of energy in the universe, and we simply don't know one way or the other, we can be absolutely sure that the amount of highly concentrated energy in the small corner of the universe we can access is sharply and distressingly finite. Since energy always tries to follow its bliss, highly concentrated energy sources are very rare. In the part of the cosmos that affects us directly, one set of those conditions exists in the heart of the sun, where gravitational pressure squeezes hydrogen nuclei so hard that some of them fuse into helium. Another set exists here on the Earth's surface, where plants concentrate energy in their tissues by tapping into the flow of energy dispersing from the sun, and other living things do the same thing by tapping into the energy supplies created by the plants. Now and again in the long history of life on Earth, a special set of conditions have allowed energy stockpiled by plants to be buried and concentrated further by slow geological processes, yielding the fossil fuels we use so recklessly. Kinetic energy from water and wind are also powered by sunlight, though the energy they contain is in much less concentrated form. The vast majority of the energy we have on hand here on Earth comes directly or indirectly from the sun. That in itself defines our problem neatly. As already mentioned, by the time it gets through 93 million miles of deep space, then filters its way down through the Earth's relatively murky atmosphere, the energy in sunlight is pretty thoroughly dispersed. Each individual photon has the same energy it had when it left the sun's atmosphere, to be sure, but the photons are much more spread out than they were inside the orbit of Mercury. The low concentration of solar energy reaching Earth is among the reasons why green plants stockpile less than 1% of the energy in the light striking their leaves. Sunlight just isn't that concentrated, and if you want it to do work, you have to invest a great deal of energy to concentrate it first. A crisis of concentration. The importance of concentration in determining how much work a given energy source can do is basic thermodynamics, of the sort that every American high school student used to learn in physics class back in those long-departed days when American high schools had physics classes worth the name. The habits of thinking made automatic by so many years of abundant fossil fuels have made the implications of that principle difficult to grasp. To people in the industrial world, at least, the results of applying the principle of concentration are often counterintuitive. Plenty of people miss them and fumble predictions as a result. The current brouhaha over anthropogenic climate change offers a good example. A great deal of concentrated fertilizer has been heaped over the issues by propaganda factories on all sides of the debate. But beneath it all is the tolerably well-documented fact that we're in the middle of a significant shift in global climate, focused on the North Polar region of the globe. The causes of that shift are by no means entirely settled, but it seems a little silly to insist, as some people do, that the mass dumping of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere by humanity can't have anything to do with it, or for that matter, that it's a good idea to keep on dumping those gases into an atmospheric system that may already be dangerously unstable for reasons of its own. Still, for the next decade or more, that bad idea is very likely to remain standard practice around the world, and one reason for that is that climate change activists become their own worst enemies once they define the crisis as global warming. That seems sensible enough. After all, we're talking about an increase in the total quantity of heat in the Earth's atmosphere. But here as elsewhere, the fixation on quantity misses the crucial point at issue. Thomas Friedman scored a bullseye in his book Hot, Flat, and Crowded when he pointed out that what we're facing isn't global warming, but global weirding. Not a simple increase in temperature, but an increase in all kinds of unexpected and disruptive weather events. As the atmosphere heats up, the most important effect of that shift isn't the raw increase in temperature, it's the increase in the difference in energy concentration between the atmosphere and the oceans. The thermal properties of water make the seas warm up much more slowly than the air and the Earth's land surface. Even a fairly modest change in the quantity of heat causes a much more significant change in the capacity of the atmosphere to do work, since what determines energy's capacity to do work, again, is the difference in concentration between the energy source and its environment. The work that the Earth's atmosphere does is called weather. From a physicist's point of view, the atmosphere is a titanic engine, using the temperature difference between sunlight and deep space to pump huge masses of air and water vapor around the planet. The better the insulation of the engine, and from a physics perspective, the greenhouse effect is simply a way of improving the insulation on the atmosphere, the more efficiently it can concentrate heat and moisture in some places and take them away from others. The most visible result of a relatively rapid rise in the heat concentration of the atmosphere isn't a generalized warming. Rather, it's an increase in extreme weather conditions on both ends of the temperature scale. This isn't a new point. It has been made repeatedly by some climate scientists and, interestingly enough, by large insurance companies as well. The huge reinsurance firm Munich Re, for example, pointed out a few years back that at the current rate of increase, the annual cost of natural disasters caused by global climate change would exceed the gross domestic product of the world well before the end of the 21st century. Had climate activists taken that as their central theme, the abnormally harsh storms in the eastern half of North America in the winter of 2009-2010 would have provided plenty of grist for their mills. Even hardcore skeptics, as they shoveled snow from their driveways for the fourth or fifth time in a row, might have started to wonder if there was something to the claim that greenhouse gas dumping was causing the weather to go wild. Instead, seduced by our culture's fixation on quantity, most climate advocates define the problem purely as a future of too much heat. And those same skeptics, shoveling those same driveways, rolled their eyes and wished that a little global warming would show up to help them out. It may be too late for climate change activists to switch their talking points from global warming to global weirding and be believed by anybody who isn't already convinced, and so we'll likely have to wait until the first major global climate disaster before any significant steps get taken. Still, the same confusion between energy quantity and concentration pervades nearly all of today's discussions about renewable energy. It's easy to insist, for example, that the quantity of solar energy falling annually on some fairly small fraction of the state of Nevada, let's say, is equal to the quantity of energy that the U.S. uses as electricity each year, and to jump from there to insisting that if we just cover 100 square miles of Nevada with mirrors so that all the sunlight can be used to generate steam, we'll be fine. What gets misplaced in appealing fantasies of this sort? Broadly speaking, three things. The first is the usual nemesis of renewable energy schemes, the problem of net energy. It would take a substantial amount of highly concentrated energy to build that 100 square mile array of mirrors, counting the energy needed to manufacture the mirrors, the tracking assemblies, the pipes, the steam turbines, and all the other hardware, as well as the energy needed to produce all the raw materials that go into them. It would take another very large amount of concentrated energy, regularly supplied, to keep it in good working order amid the dust, sandstorms, and extreme temperatures of the Nevada desert. If the amount of energy produced by the scheme came anywhere close to what's theoretically possible, this would probably be the only time in history that this has ever occurred with a very new, very large, and very experimental technology. Subtract the energy costs of building and running the plant from the energy you could reasonably, as opposed to theoretically, expect to get out of it, and the results would inevitably be a good deal less impressive than they look when presented on paper by enthusiasts. The second is another equally common nemesis of renewable energy schemes, the economic dimension. Plenty of renewable advocates say, in effect, that people want electricity and 100 square miles of mirrors in Nevada will provide it. So what are we waiting for? This sort of thinking is extremely common, of course. Mention that any popular technology you care to name might not be economically viable in a future of energy and resource constraints, and you're sure to hear plenty of arguments that it has to be economically feasible because basically it's so nifty. There's a reason for this blindness to the economic dimension. It's a natural human response to the relative ease of accessing capital, materials, and labor in an age of abundance, like the one that's coming to an end around us right now. The end of that age, though, makes this way of thinking a hopeless anachronism. In an era of energy and resource constraints, any proposed use of energy and resources must compete against all the other existing and potential uses for a supply that is no longer adequate to meet them all. Let me say that again. In an era of energy and resource constraints, any proposed use of energy and resources must compete against all the other existing and potential uses for a supply that is no longer adequate to meet them all. Market forces and political decisions both play a part in the resulting process of triage. If investing billions of dollars, and more importantly, the equivalent amounts of energy and resources, in mirrors in the Nevada desert doesn't produce as high an economic return as other uses of that same money, energy and resources, are going to draw the short straw. Political decisions can override that calculus to some extent, but impose an equivalent requirement. If investing that money, energy, and resources in mirrors doesn't produce as high a political payoff as other uses of the same things, again, the fact that 100 square miles of mirrors might theoretically allow America's middle classes to maintain some semblance of their current lifestyle is not going to matter 2 photons in a Nevada sandstorm. Barbarism and good brandy. Still, the failure to grasp the implications of net energy on the one hand and economic triage on the other both unfold from a deeper failure to think through the implications of thermodynamic reality. These implications comprise the third thing that's consistently misplaced in fantasies of the mirrors in Nevada variety. The solar energy that reaches the Earth is relatively diffuse. It takes a great deal of hardware to concentrate it to the point that you can run today's technologies with it. And that hardware has to be paid for in terms of energy as well as economics. This is not a new problem, either. Big solar power schemes of the sort now being proposed were repeatedly tried from the late 19th century on, and just as repeatedly turned out to be economic duds. Consider the solar engine devised and marketed by American engineer Frank Schumann in the first decades of the 20th century. The best solar engine of its time, and still the basis of a good many solar power designs today, it was an extremely efficient device that focused sunlight via parabolic troughs onto water-filled pipes that drove an innovative low-pressure steam engine. Schumann's trial project in Medea, Egypt, used 5 parabolic troughs, 204 feet long and 13 feet wide. The energy produced by this sizable and expensive array, all of 55 horsepower. Technology could do better, doubtless, but not much better, given the law of diminishing returns that affects all movements in the direction of efficiency. And the evidence of solar power schemes to date suggests that the improvements will not be enough to matter. Does this mean that solar energy is useless? Not at all. What it means is that a relatively diffuse source of energy, such as sunlight, is not an efficient way to run the kind of technology created to use a relatively concentrated source, such as coal. That's what Schumann was trying to do. Like most of the solar pioneers of his time, he had done the math, realized that fossil fuels would run out in the not indefinite distant future, and argued that they would have to be replaced by solar energy. "One thing I feel sure of," he wrote, "and that is that the human race must finally utilize direct sun power or revert to barbarism." Unquote. He may have well been right, but trying to make lukewarm sunlight serve the same functions as the blazing heat of burning coal is not an effective response. The difficulty, as already explained, is that whenever you turn energy from one form into another, you inevitably lose energy to waste heat in the process. Your energy concentration goes down accordingly, and so does the amount of work your energy can do. If you have abundant supplies of a highly concentrated fuel, such as coal or petroleum, that doesn't matter. But with a diffuse energy source such as sunlight, it impacts the economic feasibility of the project very quickly. This is why Schumann's solar plant, which covered well over 13,000 square feet, produced less power than a very modest diesel engine that cost a small fraction of Schumann's costs to build and operate. Now, of course, there have been significant improvements on the efficiency of some of the processes involved in those early solar engines. A good many of the basic limits that the 19th and early 20th century solar pioneers faced are not subject to technological improvement because they unfold from the difference between diffuse and concentrated energy. Nearly 30 years ago, when I was studying appropriate technology in college, a standard example of thermodynamic limits was ordinary geothermal heat. This is the gentle warmth that filters up through the Earth's crust from the mantle many miles below, where there isn't any underground magma close enough to the surface to set off geysers and make commercial geothermal plants an option. There's a huge amount of it, but it's very diffuse. And as a result, a few calculations will show that the energy you get from pumping the heat to the surface and using it to drive an engine will be less than the energy needed to run the pumps. On the other hand, if all you want is diffuse heat, you're looking in the right place. Hooking up a heat pump to a hole in the ground and using the results for domestic heating and cooling has proven to be an efficient and economical technology in recent years. The same thing is true for OTEC, OTEC, and other of those ideas whose time is always about to come and never quite arrives. OTEC stands for Oceanic Thermal Energy Conversion, and it is supposed to do with the thermal difference between deep and surface water, what a geothermal power plant does with the thermal difference between hot rocks half a mile down and the cold surface of the planet. You can run a heat engine on OTEC power, but it takes about 2/3 of the power the plant can generate to run the pumps that bring cold water up from the depths. That means the plant has a net energy of 0.33 or so, even before factoring in the energy costs of the OTEC plant. In practical terms, what it means is that you fund your plant with government grants or you go broke. On the other hand, there's at least one resort in the Pacific that uses OTEC for the far simpler task of air conditioning. Again, if all you need to do is move diffuse heat around, a diffuse energy source is more than adequate. It's when you need to do something more complex that you have problems. A closer look at why that happens may be useful here. The core concept to grasp is that for energies hardwired into the laws of thermodynamics, converting energy from one form into another is highly inefficient. A heat engine is an energy converter. It takes in concentrated heat and puts out mechanical energy through a rotating shaft, which is then hooked up to a drivetrain, a propeller, a generator, or some other application. Of all the energy released by burning gasoline in an average automobile engine, which is a form of heat engine, only around 25% goes into turning the crankshaft. The rest is lost as diffuse heat. If you're smart and careful, you can get a heat engine to reach efficiencies above 50%. A modern combined cycle electric generation plant working at top efficiency can hit 60%, but that's about as good as the physics of the process will permit. Most other ways of turning one form of energy into another are no more efficient than heat engines, and many of them are much less so. This is why heat engines are used so extensively in modern technology. Inefficient as they are, they're better than nearly all of the alternatives. The reason nobody worries much about these inefficiencies is that our heat engines run on fossil fuels, and fossil fuels contain so much energy in so concentrated a form that the inefficiencies aren't a problem. 75% of the energy in the gas you pour into your car gets turned into diffuse heat and dumped via the radiator. But you don't have to care. There's still more than enough energy to keep you zooming down the road. With alternative energy sources, though, you do have to care. That's why the difference between diffuse and concentrated energies matters so crucially. Not only specific technologies, but whole classes of technologies on which the modern industrial world depends embody such massive inefficiencies that diffuse energy sources won't keep them running without losses that make them hopelessly uneconomical. Lose 75% of the energy in a gallon of gasoline to waste heat, and you can shrug and pour another gallon into the tank. Lose 75% of the energy coming out of a solar collector in the same way, and you may have passed the point at which solar collecting no longer does enough work to be worth the energy and money it costs to build and maintain it. The one way around this problem is to use the behavior of energy in your favor. Energy turns into diffuse heat with very high efficiencies, sometimes approaching 100%. And if you set out deliberately to make use of diffuse heat, you can take advantage of this fact. This is why using sunlight to heat water, air, food, or anything else to temperatures in the low 3 digits on the Fahrenheit scale is among the most useful things you can do with solar energy. And why, when you're starting out with diffuse heat, the most practical things you can do with it usually involve leaving it as diffuse heat. Augustin Mochot, the great 19th century pioneer of solar energy, kept running up against this issue in his work. Mochot's motivations were much the same as Schumann's. He began working with solar energy out of a concern that France, handicapped by its limited reserves of coal, needed some other energy source to compete in the industrial world of the late 19th century. He built the world's first successful solar steam engines, but they faced the same problems of concentration that made Schumann's more sophisticated project an economic failure. A typical Mochot engine, his 1874 Tours demonstration model, used 56 square feet of conical reflector to focus sunlight on a cylindrical boiler and generated all of 1/2 horsepower. Yet some of his other solar projects were much more successful. For many years, the French Foreign Legion relied on one of his inventions in their campaigns, a collapsible solar oven that could be packed into a box 20 inches square. It had the same general design as the engine, a conical reflector focusing sunlight onto a cylinder that pointed toward the sun. But it worked, and worked well. The Michaud oven could cook a large pot roast from raw to well done in under a half hour. Cooking a roast is a process that uses diffuse heat. In most contemporary kitchens, we take highly concentrated energy in the form of electrical or natural gas and turn that into diffuse heat in an oven. But if what you have is the diffuse heat of sunlight, you can cook a roast with great efficiency. In other of Michaud's inventions, a solar still designed for France's brandy industry proved equally successful, converting wine into brandy at a rate of 5 gallons an hour. Interestingly, the still's reliance on diffuse solar heat turned out to have an unexpected benefit. As every moonshiner knows, one common problem in distilling alcoholic beverages is the unpredictable appearance of hot spots in the still that give the result a burnt taste. The steady solar heat of Michaud's still did not have that problem. The still turned out a superior brandy. Quote, bold and agreeable to the taste, Michaud wrote proudly, and with the savor and bouquet of an aged eau de vie. I don't know what that is. Again, diffuse sunlight doesn't convert well to mechanical motion via a steam engine due to the inevitable conversion losses, but it's very efficient as a source of heat. The point to take away from these examples is that the technology that's useful, appropriate, and economically viable in a setting of energy and resource constraints is not the same as a technology that's useful, appropriate, and economically viable in a setting of abundance. Let me say that again. The point to take away from these examples is that the technology that's useful, appropriate, and economically viable in a setting of energy and resource constraints is not the same as the technology that's useful, appropriate, and economically viable in a setting of abundance. Centralized power generation is another good example. If you've got ample supplies of highly concentrated energy, it makes all the sense in the world to build centralized power plants to burn fossil fuels, convert the result to electricity, and send the electricity across hundreds or thousands of miles to consumers who turn it into diffuse heat. You'll lose plenty of energy at every point along the way, especially in the conversion of one form of energy to another. But if your sources are concentrated and abundant, that doesn't matter much. If concentrated energy sources are scarce and rapidly depleting, on the other hand, this sort of extravagance can no longer be justified, and after a certain point, it can no longer be afforded. Working with diffuse energy. This has very troubling implications for an economic system that has built essentially all of its technology to run on highly concentrated energy. Fossil fuels are as concentrated as they are because the energy they contain was gathered over countless centuries and then concentrated by geological processes involving fantastic amounts of heat and pressure over millions of years. They define the upper end of the curve of energy concentration, at least on this planet. To bring the energy from any other source up to the same concentrations as fossil fuels requires paying entropy's price in a big way. The energy costs of concentration have to be factored in, which is why no other energy resource can compete with fossil fuels in economic terms. As fossil fuel supplies deplete, an economic system that depends on them for its survival risks finding itself in a very nasty bind. Our industrial economies certainly have proceeded to make that bind even worse by using part of the fossil fuels that still remains to concentrate more diffuse resources to the same concentrations as fossil fuels. This is the logic underlying most of the currently popular renewable energy technologies. To make and maintain a solar panel, a big wind turbine, or an ethanol plant, it's necessary to use up a great deal of concentrated energy. Raw materials must be extracted and refined, a variety of complex manufacturing processes must be performed, and the end result is then shipped hundreds or thousands of miles. And all this work has to be done with highly concentrated energy sources, mostly fossil fuels, because that's what our current technology is designed to use. Thus, trying to produce highly concentrated energy out of diffuse sources is a losing bargain that actually increases the drawdown on remaining supplies of concentrated energy. The only other option the most economists and mainstream energy mavens have been willing to discuss, ignoring renewable energy sources, continuing to draw down fossil fuels, and praying for a scientific miracle to bail us out of the consequences of our own lack of foresight, is even less promising. Still, there is at least one other option, which is to learn to do as much as possible with relatively diffuse energy, while husbanding the remaining stocks of highly concentrated energy sources for those necessary tasks that can't be done without them. This offers unexpected possibilities because many of the things we do with concentrated energy could be done with more diffuse energy instead. Nearly every home in the industrial world, for example, has hot water on tap. This is by no means a pointless luxury. The contemporary habits of washing dishes, clothes, and bodies with ample amounts of hot water and soap have eliminated whole categories of illnesses that plagued our ancestors not that long ago. A very large fraction of those homes get that hot water by burning fossil fuels, either right at the hot water heater or at a power plant that uses the heat to generate the electricity that does the heating. A society that has ample supplies of fossil fuels can afford to do that. A society running out of concentrated energy sources is likely to face increasing troubles doing so. The crucial point, not often recognized, however, it doesn't take concentrated energy to heat a tank full of water from ambient temperature to 120 degrees or so. The same thing can be done very effectively by diffuse energy sources such as sunlight. Enter the solar water heater. This is arguably the most mature and successful solar technology in existence right now. The process is simple. One of several kinds of collectors gather heat from the sun and transmit it either to water in places that don't get freezing temperature or to an antifreeze solution in places that do. In a water system, the hot water goes from the collector to an insulated tank and eventually to the hot water faucet. In an antifreeze system, the antifreeze circulates through a heat exchanger that passes the heat to the water, which then goes into an insulated tank to wait for its moment of glory. A well-designed solar hot water system will cut a home's energy use to heat water by 70%. In the Sun Belt, it's not at all uncommon for a solar hot water system to render any other hot water heater unnecessary. It will doubtless occur to my readers that installing a solar hot water system in their homes will not save the world from the consequences of fossil fuel depletion. What it will do is take part of the work now being done by highly concentrated energy sources, most of which are rapidly depleting and can be expected to become more expensive in real terms over the decades to come, and hand it over to a readily available energy source of much lower concentration that, among other things, happens to be free. That's an obvious practical gain for the residents that install solar water heating. It's also a collective gain for the community and society, since remaining supplies of fossil fuels can be freed up for more urgent uses or, just possibly, left in the ground where they arguably belong. Since much of the energy that people use in their daily lives takes the form of diffuse heat, the sort that will heat water, warm a house, cook a meal, and so on, it makes more economic sense in an energy-poor society for people to gather that heat right where they are and put it to work there, rather than using concentrated energy sources from far away. The same point can be made with equal force for a great many industrial processes. When what you need is diffuse heat, and for plenty of economically important activities, such as distilling brandy, that's exactly what you need, sunlight, concentrated to a modest degree by way of reflectors, or fluid heating panels, will do the job quite effectively. This is the secret to using diffuse energy sources in an economically viable manner. Diffuse heat is where energy goes when it follows its bliss. So if you let it do what it's going to do anyway, you can turn a relatively unconcentrated energy source to heat at very high efficiencies. The heat you get is fairly mild compared to burning gasoline, for example, but that's fine for practical purposes. Again, it doesn't take intense heat to raise a bathtub's worth of water to 120 degrees, warm a chilly room, or cook a meal. And it's precisely tasks like these that solar energy and other diffuse energy sources do reliably and well. Thus, it's curious, to use no stronger word, that so eminently practical a step as installing solar hot water systems has received so little attention to date in the peak oil and climate change communities. It's all the more curious because national governments, which so often seem incapable of encountering a problem without doing their level best to make it worse, have actually done something helpful for a change. There are very substantial incentives in many countries for installing a residential solar hot water system. Why then haven't solar hot water heaters blossomed like daisies atop homes across the industrial world? Why haven't activists made a push to define this technology as one part of a meaningful response to the crisis of our times? It's an interesting question to which there are no definite answers. Partly, I suspect, it ties into the weird disconnection between belief and action that pervades the apocalyptic end of the contemporary culture. Of the sizable number of people in today's America who say they believe that the world is coming to an end in 2012, for example, and of course this book was written prior to that, how many have stopped putting money into their retirement accounts? To judge by the evidence I've been able to gather, not many. In the same way, of the people who say they recognize that today's extravagant habits of energy use are only possible because of a glut of cheap fossil fuels and will go away as fossil fuels deplete, those who are taking even basic steps to prepare themselves for a future of scarcity and socioeconomic disruption make up an uncomfortably small fraction. It's hard to imagine passengers on a sinking ship glancing over the side to see the water rising and going back to their game of shuffleboard on the deck. But a similar behavior pattern is far from rare these days. Still, part of the issue may well be the same fixation on quantity discussed already. Solar water heaters don't produce or save a great quantity of energy. Water heating uses around 15% of an average North American home's energy bill. And so a solar hot water system that replaces 70% of that will account for a bit more than 10% of total home energy use. This is still enough to pay for most professionally installed solar hot water systems in 3 to 7 years of normal use. If every home in North America put a solar hot water heater on its roof, the impact on energy consumption would be noticeable, but in terms of raw quantity, it wouldn't be huge. Still, this misses at least 3 important points. First, of course, installing a solar hot water system can very easily be one piece of a broader program of energy conservation with a much larger impact. Knock 10% off household energy use with a solar water heater, another 20% by insulating, weather stripping, and similar efficiency measures, and another 20% with lifestyle changes, and your home will be getting by with half the concentrated energy it uses right now. If even a large minority of homes in North America took these steps, or others with similar effects, the effect on energy use would be very substantial indeed. Second, there's a large and underappreciated difference between essential and non-essential energy uses, and it's one that many of us will learn to recognize in the challenging years ahead. A great deal of energy use in North America today is non-essential. Think for a moment of all the energy currently devoted to the tourism industry, a sizable sector of the U.S. economy that could be shut down tomorrow without impacting anything but the unemployment rolls. And a very large amount of that will go away as the world slides down the curve of energy descent. Whether or not hot water is strictly essential, its direct practical benefits in terms of health and comfort put it a great deal closer to the core, and that makes finding ways to provide it more important than, say, finding ways to keep video games powered. Third, as I've already suggested, we face a shortage of energy concentration rather than energy quantity. That doesn't make our predicament any less severe, given that nearly all modern technology is geared to run on highly concentrated energy, and that the survival of 7 billion people depends on the continued operation of the existing technostructure. The rapid depletion of our world's remaining reserves of highly concentrated energy could very easily lead to a grim future even in the presence of vast amounts of diffuse energy. Still, This also means that taking steps to meet as many energy needs as possible using relatively diffuse energy sources can have a disproportionate impact on the way that future unfolds. This is where E.F. Schumacher's concept of intermediate technology becomes central to a thoughtful response to the predicament of our time. Schumacher's idea, which he applied specifically to the non-industrial nations of his own time, was that state-of-the-art factories and an economy dependent on exports to the rest of the world are not exactly that useful to a relatively poor nation trying to build an economy from the ground up. He was right, of course. Those third-world nations that have prospered since his time are precisely the ones that used trade barriers to shelter low-tech domestic industries and entered the export market only after building a domestic industrial base one step at a time. But in a future in which all of us will be a good deal poorer than we are today, his insights have a wider value. A state-of-the-art factory, after all, is costly in terms much more concrete than those of the tertiary economy. A great deal more concentrated energy has to go into building and maintaining one than you need to build and maintain a workshop that uses hand tools and human muscles to produce the same goods. Thus, the concept of intermediate technology, and a great many of the specific technologies Schumacher and his associates and successors created under that banner, provide crucial resources as the age of cheap, abundant fossil fuels is drawing to an end. When concentrated energy is scarce, local production of diffuse energy for local use is a far more viable way to support most sectors of the economy. This will allow what highly concentrated energies are left to be directed to those applications that actually need them, while also shielding local economies from the consequences of the partial or total breakdown of centralized energy systems. The resulting economy may not have much resemblance to today's fantasies of a high-tech future, but the barbarism Frank Schumann feared is not the only alternative to that future. There's something to be said for a society, even a relatively impoverished and resource-scarce one, that can still reliably provide its inhabitants with hot baths, warm rooms in winter, and well-done pot roasts, and, as Augustin Michaud would likely have pointed out, good brandy. What this means ultimately is that the change from today's industrial economy to the economies of the future can't be accomplished by plugging in some other energy source to replace petroleum or other fossil fuels. Nor can it be done by downscaling existing technologies to fit a sparser energy budget. It requires reconceiving our entire approach to technology, starting with the paired recognitions that the very modest supply of concentrated energy sources we can expect to have after the end of the fossil fuel age will have to be reserved for those tasks that still need to be done and can't be done with any more diffuse source, and that anything that can be done with diffuse energy needs to be done with diffuse energy if it's going to be done at all. A society running on diffuse energy resources will thus not be able to make use of the same kinds of technology as a society running on concentrated energy resources, and attempts to run most existing technologies off diffuse renewable sources are much more likely to be distractions than useful options. In the transition from today's technology dominated by concentrated energy to tomorrow's technology dominated by diffuse heat, in turn, some of the most basic assumptions of contemporary economic thought, and of contemporary life for that matter, are due to be thrown out the window. The Economics of Entropy. At this point, we can sum up the implications of this chapter in terms of the economic issues central to the argument of this book. The first point that has to be grasped is that the claims made every decade or so that we can power the world off some relatively diffuse energy source need to be added to the same round file as perpetual motion schemes. Today's industrial societies require very highly concentrated energy sources. Our transportation networks, our power grids, and most of the other ways that we use energy all work by dispersing very high concentrations of energy all at once into waste heat. And without the highly concentrated energy resources to power them, those things won't work at all. The second point is that there are still plenty of economically productive things that can be done with more diffuse energy sources. Solar water heating is a mature and highly successful technology. So is passive solar heating for buildings. So are a good many other uses, such as solar ovens for cooking, water purification, and the like. There are many other proven technologies using other forms of diffuse renewable energy, and these are also well worth implementing. All these can contribute mightily to the satisfaction of human needs and wants, but they presuppose social and economic arrangements that have little in common with the centralized energy system of power plants, refineries, and power grids that we have today. As concentrated energy from fossil fuels becomes scarce, in other words, and diffuse energy from renewable sources has to take up the slack, many of the ground rules shaping today's economic decisions will no longer apply. This means, in effect, that entropy must find its way into every part of economic thinking. It's worth noting that most of today's economic theories admit entropy in one way or another into the secondary economy. It's generally admitted that producing goods and services consumes resources and produces waste, and that energy fed into the process is lost to entropy in one way or another. Most current economic thought, however, explicitly rejects the role of entropy in the primary economy, insisting that resources are by definition always available, if only you invest enough labor and capital. As for the tertiary economy, most economic theories accept it as a given that tertiary wealth can increase indefinitely over time. It is not merely free from entropy, but moves in the opposite direction. In the real world, by contrast, the primary economy is just as subject to entropy as the secondary one. Oil that has been pumped out of the ground and burned is no longer available to use as an energy resource, and if enough of it has been pumped out, the oil field runs dry and it stops being a resource too. The Earth can keep some resources available at a steady level by surfing the very slow entropic decline of the sun, but only if human actions don't mess up the natural cycles that turn sunlight into renewable resources. And even so, those resources are not available in limitless amounts. Ignoring entropy in the primary economy of nature thus sets conventional economics up for a future of repeated and accelerating failure. And the tertiary economy? This is where things get interesting, because the claim that tertiary wealth increases over time has been accepted even by most critics of contemporary economics. There has accordingly been a flurry of proposals for changing the way money works so that it loses value over time, or otherwise is reinvented to make it fit the realities of life on a limited and fragile planet. These efforts are understandable, but they are also unnecessary because money as it exists today has an exquisite mechanism for losing value over time. The only difficulty is that mainstream economists and the general public alike treat it with the same shudder of dread and indignation that their Victorian ancestors directed towards sex. We're talking, of course, about inflation. Inflation is the primary way that the tertiary economy resolves the distortions caused by the mismatch between the limitless expansion of the tertiary economy, on the one hand, and the hard limits ecology and entropy place on the primary and secondary economies, on the other. When the amount of paper wealth in the tertiary economy outstrips the production of actual non-financial goods and services in the other two economies, inflation balances the books by making money lose part of its value. I suspect, though it would take a good econometrician to put this to the test, that in the long run, the paper value lost to inflation equals the paper value manufactured by interest on money, once the figures are adjusted for actual increases or decreases in the production of goods and services, and for tertiary wealth lost in other ways, such as bond defaults and bank failures. It's instructive to note in this context what happens when governments attempt to stop the natural balancing process of inflation. In American economic history, there are two periods in which this was attempted in a big way. The first was between the Civil War and the First World War, and the second was between 1978 and 2008. In the first of these periods, the U.S. Treasury reacted against the rampant inflation of the Civil War years by imposing a strict gold standard on the currency. Despite the claims of today's precious metal advocates, this did not produce economic stability and prosperity. Quite the contrary. The pace at which new gold entered the economy was less than the rate at which the production of goods and services expanded, and the result was the longest sustained bout of deflation in the history of the United States. The economic terrain of the second half of the 19th century was thus a moonscape, cratered by disastrous stock market collapses and recurrent depressions. The resulting bank and business failures probably eliminated as much paper value from the economy as inflation would have, but did so in a chaotic and unpredictable way. Instead of everybody's corporate bonds losing 5% of value each year due to inflation, for example, some bonds were paid in full while others became worthless when the companies backing them went out of existence. The same calculus has come into play since the beginning of the Volcker era of the Federal Reserve Board, when fighting inflation became the mantra of the day. Since then, we've had a succession of crashes as colorful as anything the 19th century produced. 30 years of economic policy dedicated to minimizing inflation have guaranteed a sizable second helping of economic collapse in the years to come. Still, in the longer term, I suspect inflation will also play a major role in the unraveling of the current mess. With the end of the age of cheap, abundant fossil fuels, the world faces a very substantial decrease in the amount of primary and secondary wealth in the world, and the paper wealth of the tertiary economy will have to lose value even faster to make up for that decline. Just how this will play out is anybody's guess, but one way or another, it's unlikely to be pretty. What this implies, as we have already seen, is that economic activities never exist in a vacuum. Current economic ideas took shape in an age where economic processes were dominated, one might even say distorted, by extravagant supplies of cheap and highly concentrated fossil fuel energy. The new ground rules of economics that will take shape in the twilight of the age of cheap energy will be shaped, in turn, by the recognition that energy is once again as scarce, costly, and diffuse as it has been throughout most of human history. This recognition may seem obvious enough in the abstract, but in today's economic thought, as we have seen, it is consistently ignored, and never more so than in the theme of the next chapter, the economics of technology.
That's the end of Chapter 4 of John Michael Greer's 2011 book, The Wealth of Nature. Continue to Part 5 on YouTube for Chapter 5.